Hi, this is Mark Lewison, and you're listening to Fab 4 Free for All.
And welcome to another exciting edition of Fab 4 Free for All. And we're very happy today to have a guest, a gentleman who has been on our show before. But this time he is not appearing as a member of our panel. This time he's appearing as a guest. And I am speaking, of course, of author and historian, Mr. Mark Lewison. So, good morning, Mark.
Hello, thanks for having me back.
And, of course, as always, I'm your moderator, Tony Chiguardo, being joined by Mr. Rob Leonard.
Hello, how you doing, everyone?
And Mr. Mitch Axelrod.
Glad you're tuning in to this episode.
Ooh, nice.
It's a segue, guys.
Nice
I guess it is.
Segue.
I've been waiting all these years for this.
Well, the reason why it is a segue is because the book, which is the first of a trilogy, is called Tune In. And it has been how long in the making?
About 10 years. 10 years. 2003 I started it.
And what made you decide at that point, now is the time? You have written a number of books, obviously, about the topic, about the Beatles.
Yeah, I hadn't done one in quite a while, apart from the Beatles London, which is a kind of an ongoing project I have with a couple of friends, Pete and Adam. My last book was The Chronicle, which came out in 1992, so that's quite a long time ago now.
Sure.
And I moved on from that to do other things, write about other subjects. And it was really only when I found out that I could write biography, which was not a discipline I'd ever tried before. I'd only ever written reference books. When I realised I could write biography, then I knew that I had to come back and write about the Beatles, because I felt that in terms of biography, the book I wanted to see hadn't been done yet.
We know from Mark's past history, you don't do anything halfway, which is awesome. So what we've gotten is by far the most extensive book on the early aspect of the Beatles. Tune In covers, what's the period? Just so
well, it begins way back in the mists of time in the 1840s, but it accelerates fairly rapidly from there onwards, and obviously it's very strong from their childhoods, so from when they were babies in the 1940s to 1962. It ends New Year's Eve 62.
Now, you recently told someone that this is a social history with the Beatles at the center of it.
Yeah.
So you're putting into context their lives along with what happened around them.
Yeah, I didn't just want to write a Beatles book, because that's part of the problem I have with other Beatle books, like biographies, in that they tell that story, and I wanted to see them in context. I felt that they'd be better understood in context, and they would be... You have to see them among their peers, among their contemporaries, to really understand what was going on.
Right.
What type of archives do you start at? I mean, there's so many places to start. Where did you start, and where did it lead you to?
I had a very, very, very long list of jobs to be done for this book, and it involved going to any library or archive that might tell me anything I don't know.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. I mean, I've had access down the years to the EMI archives and the BBC archives. I went to the Liverpool Record Office, that's the main public library in Liverpool, the main local history library, and spent a lot of time there. Also the main newspaper library in London that has newspapers from all over the world, and certainly all around Britain, and spent a lot of time there reading all the Liverpool newspapers. The nightly newspaper I read every issue from 1955, and it's still going on. I've got to read it till the early 70s. The south end of Liverpool, where most of the Beatles lived, I read every weekly paper from 39 to so far 67, and I will keep going beyond that as well, just to immerse myself in a city and a time that I didn't actually live there.
Sure.
You know, I mean, I was alive in the late 50s, but I wasn't there, and Liverpool is unlike anywhere else. So I really needed to steep myself in that place.
And you actually went to New Zealand you did something that no one else did.
No, I read that online. Actually, I didn't go to New Zealand. I just phoned. It's easier to phone New Zealand than to go there.
Cheaper.
So there's even myths going on about
the
Mark,
Yeah.
as opposed to just Beatle myths that are being busted.
Yeah, that was a great one because I was intent on finding out as much as I could about this legendary episode in John Lennon's childhood. Yeah. When he was, so the story goes, he was being forced to choose between his mother or his father, chose his father, and then his mother, Julia, walks dejectedly down the street and he runs after her. You know, you've seen it in all the biopics.
Absolutely, melodramatized.
Yeah, and in, Freddie Lennon, or Alf Lennon as he was, John Lennon's dad, had a book published about him based on his own unseen, to this day, memoir, and his second wife, Pauline, who is still with us, because she was much younger than him. She turned it into a book called Daddy Come Home in the mid 1980s, I think it was. And every book has value to a degree, and there's a lot of value in that book. And he mentioned the name of his friend whose house they were at in Blackpool where this happened. So I thought, right, I've got his name, I'm going to find him. And eventually I did find him in New Zealand, but didn't go there. I phoned him up and we had several phone sessions and he told me the whole story. And it was another example of how important it is to get to people while you can, and that this book should be done now because he's since died. He didn't live to see the book.
I think he passed in August.
Yeah, September.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so his widow and his daughter have seen it, but he didn't, sadly.
You spent 6 months in Liverpool, you said in the notes.
Yeah.
Was that in a row, or was that month by month, or week by week?
That's cumulatively over the period of a few years, but about 27 trips up there.
What did you get out of Liverpool that, not being a Liverpudlian, that
Yeah.
you get
From being there.
From being there.
Soaking it in.
absorbing Liverpool in?
Yeah, seeing people. I mean, I did deep genealogical research for all the guys in this book,
Right.
which had been done a little bit before, but not as thoroughly. And then I went to every place. I mean, I would check a map and I would go to absolutely every place that I could go to. Not necessarily to describe it in the book, but just to absorb it, just to feel that I've been there. I spent a lot of time in the record office, as I say, going through the archives, and they've got tremendous materials in there. All the school records are there, for example, and the baptism records and all that kind of stuff is there. So there's a lot of deep research you can do that really hasn't been done before. And apart from that, it was seeing people and just immersing myself in the local landscape.
And you did the house thing, right? The National Trust House. And, I mean, did you go there? I mean,
of course.
Yeah.
Of course. I would recommend anyone to go and do those tours of the two childhood properties, John's and Paul's. They are both fantastic. And they're looked after by a couple of really terrific custodians who approach it with the right spirit. And there was even one occasion when I was in Liverpool during all these years when... Sorry, no pun intended.
That's okay.
When Sylvia, the woman who was then doing the tours of John Lennon's house, Menlove Avenue, was unwell, and they needed someone just to step in for one tour because there was a tour coming and she wasn't well enough to handle it. And they said, would I do it? They asked if I would, and of course,
wow, what fun.
Yes. So I actually led a party of tourists around the house and talked about it with the knowledge that I gained from researching this book.
Did they know who you were?
A few people did.
Oh, very nice.
I didn't introduce myself, but
celebrity doses.
It came up. No, I didn't want to say hello. I am.
No, I know. But if they knew you,
but some of them did recognize me. Yes.
Now you had this is a two-part question, so bear with me. You had a lot of people telling you different stories.
Yes.
Memories fade, as I well know, as my own.
As we all know.
Yeah, but you had different people telling you different things about probably the same event. And George Harrison said a very famous quote, if you want to tell the quote, George said to you, in their bid to...
Oh, in their bid to tell what they know, sometimes people tell more than what they know.
Yeah, and he also said something else. I think he told you, you weren't there.
Yeah, he told me a couple of times, how can you write about us? You were there.
Well, actually, you were now.
I like the. That was very George.
Well, that's it.
So how did you handle... I know how you handled it, but I'd like you to tell our listeners how you handle in the book, quite frankly, when you got different versions of stories.
It's very well done.
Thank you. First of all, there are people I avoid completely because I know that I'm aware of what they say in interviews, and I just don't want any part of that kind of stuff, the artificial stuff that people make up.
Right.
Otherwise, when I'm interviewing people, I just sit and, without revealing anything in my face, I just quietly know what I will and won't be using. Because, I mean, even in someone who's giving you the most honest interview they can give you, 98% of it might be right, but there'll still be 2% where you think, oh, that doesn't add up.
Right.
It just doesn't add up. And I won't use anything that does not add up. I won't use anything that I'm uncertain of, dubious about.
And you are honest in the book. You say at some point, there's not much known about this part or this event.
Absolutely. And there are quite a few places in the book where I say all that we know of this is.
Right.
Because it's not for me to try and bluster a way through and make absolutely clear what happened. If we're light on information, why not say so?
Yeah.
And I think in years gone by I might have approached that differently, but
You mentioned that when John first met Paul. There's a little liner or note underneath saying, well, he actually might have met earlier and they just never talked about it.
But all we know is this.
Yes,
I put in all we know, all I know. Absolutely. But sometimes you get to a situation where one or more people, two or more people will remember the same event differently. And it isn't really necessarily for me to decide. Right. So I don't make too much a habit of this because it would wear thin, but I do every now and then say so-and-so remembers this and so-and-so remembers that, and the truth is probably somewhere in between.
And there's so much of the book is fascinating just to see it, laid out correctly and laid out truly chronologically. But also, one of the areas that's fascinating is how the bid to get them signed.
Yes.
There are so many happenings there that, to my knowledge, have really never been brought to light.
Yeah.
And I will say that was one of the most riveting segments. I mean, after the childhood.
It's quite complex, but it was a complex situation.
Yeah.
But all that was very interesting. And it all goes back to this business of was the first session on the 6th of June 62, was it a test or was it a session? And then in 1991, after the recording sessions book came out in 88, when I only had the paperwork at Abbey Road to use, and the paperwork for the early sessions was very thin. During the process of writing that book, I asked if there was anything further in the EMI archives about the Beatles contract, and I was told no. So I accepted that answer, but in 1991 I ended up in another archive in EMI that actually had all these papers I had been assured didn't exist. And they laid out a different story, which was that the contract was issued before their first session.
Right.
And it's like, well, then it's why.
Yes.
The next question is why? Why were they signed?
Right.
And I remember I was working on the making of Sgt. Pepper with George Martin in 1992, and the same time I was working, just putting my Chronicle to bed, because it came out that October. And I laid out all the documents in front of George Martin in an edit suite in London when we were putting the programme together. And I said, can you explain this to me? You appear to have signed the Beatles before you saw them. And he looked at them and he genuinely appeared befuddled about why. He just said, well, why would I have done that? And I said, I don't know, George, why would you have done that? And he appeared not to know. So when the Chronicle, I was still trying to fudge an answer to try and make things that didn't add up add up.
Right.
But with this book, I knew I had to get to the actual heart of the story, and did thanks to meeting a guy called Kim Bennett,
who is sort of the pivotal player the name that had been so unfamiliar.
Yes.
And, ended up being a key player.
Yeah, and again, I got to Kim. I spent a long time with him. He actually came to the town where I live, and I put him up in a hotel, and we did sessions over 2 days. And
hypnosis, or
well, I challenged him in every way I could. I really wanted to make sure that what he told me added up. And I really challenged him to the point where he got a bit miffed slightly during the interview because I wasn't just taking his word for it. But at the end of it, I felt satisfied that what he had told me was right. And it did make sense. And then he died. So again, the value.
So what you're saying is
we better go get a checkup.
We should all have our insurance policies.
Yeah, I was wondering if the police would come and knock on my door at some point. The only common thread linking all these deaths is that they've seen you.
The Lewison mystery.
Yes. But what it shows is that this is all a long time ago now, and you know, if this book hadn't been done now, it wouldn't have happened.
Right. One of the things that in the book that I didn't even think about until I read it was the fact that the Beatles assigned to Burt Camford. They have a 1-year deal, and that's why this first session happened in June, not in May.
Yeah.
And I never even thought of that.
Yeah.
That contract actually counted.
Yes.
You always thought it was a backup thing, and that was it. But they actually have a full contract.
And the Beatles had no idea what they'd signed when they signed their contract. It was entirely in German.
Right.
And they just put their signatures on it. And when Brian became their manager, the first thing he had to do was get a translation of this contract.
But they were minors, though, too, at the time, though, weren't they, Mark?
They were,
so,
yeah.
Would it have even
digging
really held water?
Digging for coal in Hamburg.
Exactly.
Wasn't it Paul and George who were the...
Paul and George who were minors. But, would it have held up, the Camford?
Well, Brian did... I now know from having seen his legal files in '62 that he paid a specialist German law interpreter in London to look into that contract and to see whether, being that they were minors, they could just void the whole contract.
Yeah.
But for some reason they didn't go down that line, they just let it lapse.
Probably to keep good good relations.
They had the opportunity to terminate it after 1 year and did.
Right.
But the point is that Brian didn't know when he signed them, or when he was offering to be their manager, he didn't even know what obligations they had that might prove getting a London contract impossible.
Right, what he would have to surmount.
Yeah.
Now, before we get into the heart of the book, the last thing I want to ask you about the introduction, a lot of people might read the book and say, wow, he's got a lot of boyhood stuff. I mean, they're growing up atmosphere. And you had said in the book something really important. You said they didn't become suddenly funny when they filmed A Hard Day's Night or beguiling when they recorded Rubber Soul, which I think is very telling of why you felt the need to tell how they grew up.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's important that you needed to say, you know, the humor was because of this.
Yes.
And their anger because...
And I didn't set out to do that. These are just the things that became clear while I was doing it. Right. Or at the end of it, when I actually read my own book, I realised that that's what it was telling me, that these guys were always funny, they were always original, they were always interesting, they were always different from everybody else around them, and they were always moving on, so that whenever anyone around them would catch up, copy them in some way, they would just move on.
And interestingly, though, too, you find that some of the things that we've always heard or always felt clarified more. You know, we've always had the feeling that John always needed, well, both of them, John and Paul both always needed a partner.
Yes.
John always needed a partner.
Yes.
And you bring that about from his youth.
Yes.
You know, way before Paul.
Yes.
And that's a very important
He was
aspect.
always the leader, but he always needed people around him.
Yeah.
But having said that, not that he dictated necessarily to his followers.
Right.
If you were in his group or his gang, it would be quite democratic. He was the leader, but he would devolve responsibility amongst everybody.
Right.
So, I mean, some leaders are, especially of boys, when you're in a gang and you're children, can be quite horrible to the other friends.
Right.
He was not. He was someone that his followers, his fellow gang members always looked up to.
Right.
Always.
Also, the other part of the book, which was very interesting, is the fact that Paul McCartney's rebellion.
Yes.
There's like a step up each little thing against his father, not in a mean way, not in a bad way, but to sort of establish himself that he's going to be a musician, not working in the wiring factory.
Yeah.
Or a doctor.
Or a doctor, or English professor or something.
It's a key part of this book that to understand the fact that in Paul McCartney's house, John Lennon was not appreciated.
Yeah.
Again...
But you can see why Paul's hanging out with John all the time, because he's a guy who's footloose and fancy free.
Well,
and John's saying, "Oh, don't listen to your dad." And Paul's like, "Well, should I?"
Well, actually, you know what? Let's go there, because I have right here Jim McCartney and others referred to John Lennon as that boy.
Yes.
So why don't we talk about that boy?
Not this boy.
No,
that
thank
boy.
you.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
I couldn't resist.
The humor is in the book, not in the room here.
Well, Tony hasn't
That
done any
boy,
British
this boy.
Well, thank you.
impersonations yet.
By the way, please.
No problem.
Thank you, Jeremy Hillary Bigfoot.
Yes.
All right, so why don't we talk about that boy?
Okay.
Just the whole the demeanor of John Lennon and how others perceived him.
Yes. Yeah. Well, he was. He was the product of two extraordinary parents. That's the first thing to say. We mostly know about his mother from other books, but actually his father's story is an extraordinary one as well. And clearly he's inherited talent and characteristics from both parents, but they're not around in his life very much.
No.
So he's given a proper, solid upbringing by his Aunt Mimi and his Uncle George, who died when John was 14. But he was always different. You know, you hear, I think it's in the Jan Wenner interview where he says, I was always different. I was always a genius and all that. That interview was done on the back of his therapy sessions, of course. So he had a clearer sense of who he was and what he'd always been. But certainly he was always different. You can tell that. I mean, he was very, very bright. Extraordinarily bright, creating poetry and drawings and all those things from childhood. And he was always the leader of the gang. He always had a gang around him and was never too concerned about if the boys were younger than him. Whereas, you know, that's an unusual trait in itself. Right. Mostly boys or girls only really want to go around with their own age group. They don't want to be messing around with younger kids. But he didn't mind, provided that they brought something original to the party. And the group is just an extension of the gang, really, for John.
Right.
Yeah. It even seems to extend when they get older. I was reading the passage where he brings the two young fans from the cavern over to Mendip's.
Yes, the first time.
Lou and Lindy.
Yes.
And they were, 15 at the time, and John was 22. But because he could connect with them, he felt something, whether it was the intellect or the wit or whatever.
It was all of that.
It was still it was okay.
Yeah.
It was cool for him.
Yeah, to actually invite them round to tea at Mendip's on a Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These two young girls, and all quite innocent. And that relationship that John has in the book with Linda, or Lindy as he calls her, Lindy Ness, is a really revealing relationship, part of the book about John, because he could have taken advantage of her and didn't. He just protected her and wrote letters to her and poetry and drawings and all that incredible stuff.
Well, even Thelma. Yeah, Thelma Pickles. And if you have to read the book to get into that relationship, but that was his girlfriend. She even said that when she was with him, he was a very different person. He was very sweet and sentimental, and he could have taken advantage of that as well, because he had such a weird idea of the sexuality. I mean, he slept in the same bed as Bobby Dykins and Julia when he was 5.
That was a shocking thing to really discover that. Yeah,
I mean, and to know what this boy was, again, as you say, very honestly, they were honeymooners.
Yes.
And he's in their bed. And, Mimi brought him up in a different way. A lot of the myths about Mimi was that she was like a militant bitch. Yeah. And really, you don't say that in the book. Yeah. It's such a... again, not giving anything away, you really need to read how Mimi shaped John Lennon, and even George.
Yes.
And George's death.
George, his uncle.
Yes, right. I'm sorry. His uncle George, yes. When he passed... And John wrote the poem for Mimi.
Yes.
Talk about that if you would.
Yeah, well,
that's important.
The book goes up to 62, but the assimilation of materials has to happen for the entire period, because things will be published later that referred back to the earlier period. And in 1965, a weekly magazine in England called Fabulous, which really started because of the Beatles. It was about the whole scene, but it was really the Beatles' explosion helped fashion that magazine into existence. Had a profile on Mimi, and she allowed a couple of elements from her, artifacts from her archives, from her drawers, if you like. She would just pull out all these drawers, and there was John's art and childhood stuff in there. And one of them was this poem that he wrote to Mimi on the occasion of the death of Uncle George, her husband George. And he calls Mimi the best of the 5, meaning the 5 sisters, one of whom, of course, was his mother, and said that they weren't really there for her in her hour of need. So, and this was published in 1965, and I actually had an email from Hunter Davis the other week saying, I would love to have put this in the book of the John Lennon letters, but I didn't know about it. Where did you find it? And I wrote back saying, well, it was published. It was published, but you just need, you need to get to all this material.
Oh, yeah.
And that's part of the reason why this took 10 years, because you just keep going on and deeper and deeper and deeper.
Didn't he also use Frank Sinatra's Young at Heart in that poem?
That was an interesting thing for me, because I listened while writing this book to all the music that was around through that period, and he wrote that poem in 55, and in 54 into 55 there was Frank Sinatra had a hit called Young at Heart, and John Lennon uses one of the lines from the song in this piece about Mimi. And as I say in the book, that's like, it's the first example we have of him using popular song to express an emotion.
Which is, again, nothing I've ever heard.
Not at all.
And we always knew that John and Paul wanted to write for Sinatra. And now in 55, he's stealing Sinatra, so to speak, in that one line.
I don't know about John, but Paul certainly did, because Paul's earlier songs were with Sinatra in mind. And there's also a story about Ringo, which I can't remember now if it's in this edition or the other edition, from an interview that Ringo gave where he talked about a scheme he hit upon when he was about 15 years old. He was going to write to Frank Sinatra, ask for the loan of $1 million, put it in his bank account, live off the interest, and then give the money back to Sinatra, who would be none the wiser about what had happened to his million.
Oh, yeah. Because Sinatra would just wire it over to Richie. There you go.
Why not?
Yeah,
Send that to Richie, all right?
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Well, who recorded, for Maureen? That song, Frank Sinatra.
Well, that's a different connection.
I know, it's a different, but it connects.
Maybe that's going to be
Lady
the
is a
next book.
champ.
But one thing about Ringo Starr, everyone has always spelled his name with I-E, and you say it's Y.
Yeah.
Does he sign it that way, or is that way he came across it? Because everyone else has always been I-E.
Everyone else writes it with an I-E. Sometimes with a T.
I'm not used to seeing it with the Y.
Just the Y.
But look at the way he spells it. If you look at any of the postcards he's ever sent to anybody, some of which are in circulation or they're in books, he always spells it with a Y. He spells it with a Y to this day. But for some reason, no one's noticed that
and it
before.
perpetuates.
But he never signs it with a Y anymore.
No,
he never just signs.
He never signs it anymore. We're not allowed. Now, I'm going to just bring up. To me, there's one big aspect of things that could have altered the history of the Beatles and had. I mean, there are many instances. But I'm going to bring up one really important one, and that is the law. I mean,
in
general. I mean, you don't make light of it, but you're just pointing out that they had no problem with. I won't even say petty thievery, petty larceny.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
And what a different era. And they always talk about the idea: could the Beatles happen again? We always say, obviously, no. But just that alone, I mean, can you talk a little bit about the fact that there was a hooligan aspect? In a way, we talk about a gang, but
yeah, well, they were young guys growing up in Liverpool in the late 1950s, and a lot of Liverpool boys then and to this day will fall foul of the law, or at least do things that could have them in breach of the law if they're caught.
Key words, if they're caught.
Yeah, and Alan Williams wrote a letter to the authorities in 1961 saying none of the boys has been in trouble with the law, and it's just like, absolutely, how had they got away with it to that point? John in particular was regularly thieving. He called it slap leather.
Yeah.
And it was just a wheeze for him, just a caper that he would go into a store and nick something for the fun of it, not necessarily because he needed it, but because he wanted to.
Harmonicas, guitars.
Well, the last guitar, Paul and George had the guitars, and he went and just stole the other one because his was gone.
Yeah. So, and I think Paul has admitted to doing a bit of light thieving as well, boyhood stuff. We're not talking anything serious.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
But just the idea that had that been now with the advent of video cameras, there would have been no Beatles. John would have been in a juvenile detention center.
There was a juvenile detention center just along the road from where he lived in Walton on Menlove Avenue, and that was the place that all the parents would say, "You'll end up there if you don't watch out." So. I mean, I don't know how close he came to being caught, but they actually did have clean records at the end.
Amazing.
Now, you mentioned Alan Williams. Did he really give away the Beatles?
Just because the book title said it.
Well, he was one of the first guys to write a story about that time, in 1975, I believe.
75, The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away. Yeah. Wonderful book. not entirely believable because he had a ghostwriter who liked to sensationalize. And one of the things I did for this book with Alan was go through that book and just say, is this bit right or is that bit right? And he would say, no, that Bill made that up. No, but this bit was right. And I actually did get the essence of it from him. And I interviewed him, I think, 5 times for this book, to the point where he'd kind of had enough. Yeah. But I really did need to get to the bottom of it. And Alan Williams, make no doubt about it, he is a genuine hero of this story, because without Alan Williams it wouldn't have happened.
Absolutely.
But through his own behaviour, particularly after the Beatles, conventions and the way he just conducts his own life, he's ended up being something of a joke character.
Yeah.
But in reality, what he did for them was vital. And without him it wouldn't have happened.
Oh, the one thing about this book, and I mentioned it prior, was the humor.
Yeah.
You bring up the Ruddles a lot of times.
A few references here and there.
Yeah, when we have you on the Ruddles, when we do our Ruddles show, because it's coming out on Blu-ray, we need to have you on, because I think you're not a closet Ruddles fan.
Oh, no.
I mean, there was one point where you said they arrived, and to prove it they were here. You bring up Leppo. I mean, so there's a lot of great references, which we love, but the little parts of humor in this book, such as, we go into this whole Granny Annie for Ringo. Ringo was left-handed, as we know, and Granny Annie wanted to exercise Ringo's left-handedness out of him, because it wasn't, it was voodoo to be left-handed. So you go into this whole paragraph or paragraphs about the exorcism. And then you mentioned Paul McCartney was also left-handed, but he was left unchallenged.
Yes.
And it's just so brilliant. I love the way you move into it, and especially when you're listening to Clive Mantle on the audiobook tell it.
Yeah.
When you hear someone reading it to you, the humor really shines, and I love that about this book.
But there's a significance, though, which, I mean, about how Granny Annie tried to force that out of him, because that essentially, if I'm correct, resulted in a technique that's been,
Yeah, exactly, where he's left-handed, but he's right-handed, really, but he still begins with his left.
Right.
He's playing a right-handed kit.
Playing a
as a lefty,
kit.
which you always get an extra beat. Being a drummer, you get that extra, that extra fill, that extra beat in the fill, which is very hard if you're a righty drummer to emulate.
Yeah.
It really is. That's why Ringo is considered by Phil Collins, by everybody, to be unique.
Yeah.
I mean, and most people, if you ask how many lefties are in the Beatles, they'll say one.
Yeah.
Because you don't realize it.
Yeah.
But that, I mean, Granny Annie sounds like I'd like to actually have a drink with her.
Yeah, and also she died in February 1962 when Ringo was in Hamburg playing with Tony Sheridan. And he came back just after she had died, and it was at that point that as I say in the book, his left hand was just beginning to make a comeback.
Yeah.
Because he plays piano left-handedly.
Boogie woogie.
And he just learned it at that time.
And in terms of music with all the Beatles, because we touched on John a little bit, but all 4 of them really had music in their lives. I mean, John had the harmonica first.
Yeah, his father and his grandfather both played harmonica.
Paul had the old NEMS piano.
Yeah, which NEMS from before the Epsteins got involved, but all the same, yes.
But a piano.
Yes.
George had music in his life as well, right?
His dad had a guitar,
right,
which he'd pawned because the times were really tight, but it also had these records.
Oh yeah,
a lot of American records and English records.
And Ringo just had the hospital.
Well, he did, but actually there was he had these family parties, which always Liverpool is a very musical place. The fact that they come from there is crucial, because they had music around them all the time in their families and at family parties.
Yeah.
The McCartney family parties are obviously very musical occasions, because there were quite a few musical people there and everyone's singing along and having a great time. So music was a big part of all their childhoods.
And I mean, Ringo, I say the hospital because really that's where Ringo first got the drum.
Yes.
And that's important. I mean, I hate to sound like, he was sick and that was important for him becoming a drummer, but it's just fact.
Yeah, well, as I say in the book, I'm saying in the book, it's them saying it, really.
Yes.
He says that he saw a drum in a window on his way to school and was just fixated on this single tom-tom drum in a window, not the guitars, not anything else, but just that drum. But it was too expensive for him to buy. When he was in hospital, because they were missing so much of their education, a vocational teacher would come to the hospital and do things with them like making baskets and sewing, and there was this musical thing where you would have to hit an instrument depending on the note that the teacher had up on a board, and he only wanted the drum. And from the moment he hit it, that was it. He knew he wanted to be a drummer. And the great thing about the Richie Starkey story, which is very strong in this book, is that he was very single-minded and very determined and very tough little kid, despite his body was frail in terms of the illnesses that he kept suffering, but mentally very strong always.
Speaking of Richie's story in the book, it's fascinating too, Mark, because it blows me away that this still perpetuates, but you still have the attitude from the casual person on the street sometimes that it's John Paul George and the lucky guy.
Yeah.
And the reality of it was that he was playing professionally first.
Yes.
His abilities seemed to develop in leaps and bounds. He came to the instrument later than the others had come to theirs, in a way, it seemed. Right? Or just about the same time, I guess?
About the same time.
But he, had that love of music that came a little later.
Yeah,
but,
he was always determined. He was always looking for the next opportunity. Yeah. He was prepared to throw in his apprenticeship after 4 years when, after one more year he would complete it. And you can imagine the family's point of view on that one.
Yeah.
Like he would give up the opportunity to have a trade for life just to go and play drums in a holiday camp. But he always saw himself on the Palladium. There was that saying that he talks about in the anthology that Annie Maguire, Elsa's friend, would say, "See you on the Palladium, son, see your name in lights." And it was ludicrous that she should say such a thing, and ludicrous that he would even consider it possible. But it was in his head. And the great thing about this story is, one of so many, of course, is that he eventually does get to the Palladium in Volume 2, and that is not the pinnacle that Annie Maguire had thought it would be.
Right.
It's merely a stepping stone. Because in Britain in those days, the pinnacle of show business was the Palladium, but the Beatles showed that there were pinnacles as yet unknown.
Right. But it was maybe for the people in Liverpool, maybe that was the ultimate. But for the Beatles, it always showed that they were going one step further.
Yeah,
they needed that just as that stepping stone.
Yeah, and when he joined the Beatles, they obviously had the ability and the management to get them to the Palladium. He was never going to get there with the Hurricanes, with Rory Storm.
Hi, everyone. Just wanted to let you know that besides Fab 4 Free-for-All, each of the three of us are involved in our own individual projects. Mitch Axelrod's 2 books, Beatletoons, the only book about the cartoon Beatles show, and Little Billy and Baseball Bob, can be found through all of your good booksellers online, including Amazon.com, or if you'd like autographed copies, contact Mitch on Facebook.
And my buddy Rob Leonard has a great Beatles show that he's been doing for 20 years called Beatles Songs, and it's on every Friday night from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you can listen to it online. It's streaming at www.ncc.edu/WHPC, and also look for it on tunein.com.
And Tony Truquardo is the host of 4F, Free Format for Free, on WCWP 88.1 on Long Island. He's on every Monday from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and also at www.wcwp.org. Also available on tunein.com. In the book, there's a lot of different mentions of, like, the Beatles came close to breaking up several times.
Yeah.
And it's hard to believe looking back, because you see John, Paul, and George as a team, but there were times where it was going to end. It was just like the car ran out of gas almost. And then something came up and would continue them, basically.
The first one in the book is 1960, when it does appear, and it's one of those stories for which we don't have every piece of the puzzle, but it does appear that John and Stuart and maybe George decided to go down to London and work with this beat poet called Royston Ellis, who they'd met in Liverpool, and seemingly were about to break up the group, but ultimately it didn't happen, and they ended up back in Liverpool and everything carried on as usual. That's a frustrating story in that we don't have all the pieces. And then in 61 it's really clear to me, in a way that I never knew before, that they were about to break up just before Brian became their manager. That old line of would they have made it without Brian, would they or wouldn't they have made it, is actually clearer now, in the sense it looks like they wouldn't have even existed without Brian. Because they were about to break up. And why? Because they were bored.
Yeah. Right.
And why were they bored? Because they were kings and there was no new challenge for them.
Right.
Only after a few months. I mean, it makes the Beatles so different to all their contemporaries, that kind of attitude.
Well, to me, in the book, 1961 is such a revelation, because there's so much in there that I didn't know about, just the way it all sort of connects.
Yeah.
And, you think at the end of the year in November, Brian Epstein shows up, and it just connects. But there were other things before that. You're right. They became the Kings.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
It's Liverpool.
But even before that, fate could have intervened as well. And I didn't know this, and a lot of our listeners will not have known this, that the restrictions from the National Service.
Oh, yes.
I mean, that's important.
Yeah.
Because,
you
tell it.
That's crucial again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, conscription in the UK was mandatory from, I think, 1939. Obviously, during the war, men were conscripted to fight against the Germans. But beyond that, Britain kept an army of conscripts. And if you were 18 years old in the UK, in that period of time, you had to go and do your army duty for 18 months, plus another 6 months in reserve. So essentially 2 years. And it was the one unavoidable fact of life. Unless you happened to be medically unfit, you would have to go off and do your army duty. And this loomed greatly for John, Paul, George and Richie and Stuart and all the other guys. It loomed over their lives, over their teenage years, like this terrible threat that they knew was coming and they couldn't avoid it. And then by just being the right age at the right time, they avoided it because the law changed.
Yeah.
Had the law not changed, they would have gone into the army. And as I say in the book, George would have done his army service from 1962 to 64. He wouldn't have been on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Right.
He would have been in a barracks somewhere polishing his boots.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And Paul from 61 to 63. I mean, formative years in the formation of John, Paul, George, and Richie, or the undesirable member, or whichever they had as the drummer. It's like Spinal Tap at that point.
Well, in a way, I would imagine that change was partly responsible for that entire scene, because it also probably gave them, I would imagine, psychologically, this newfound feeling of having been cut loose from everything that was impending before.
Absolutely, Tony, yeah, it would.
So
it did.
Well,
it must have done.
I got a question. The overhang of World War II, it's only 15 years, 16 years. When does that get cut, basically, in Great Britain?
It doesn't get cut
or at least in Liverpool.
For the generation that lived through it. Of course, it never got cut. I mean, I grew up, I was born in 58, and I still remember war was the main topic of conversation through my childhood, because it was such an extraordinary event for everyone who had lived through it. And we'd had rationing until the mid-1950s, unlike in America, where you just kind of prospered immediately after the war. Right. In Britain, we were bombed to hell, and we had shortages of everything. But I think it's the arrival of American music in the lives of these lads that really does it. When they hear Bill Haley, and then Elvis, and then Little Richard, and then everybody else, Jerry Lee, Carl,
like Clarion
Chuck Berry. Yeah, and because it was American, I mean, I cannot stress enough that to a young Englishman then, America was the promised land. Over here, everything you did was wonderful. In England, everything was kind of second rate.
Right.
It wasn't,
right.
but there was that perception.
Sure.
And certainly when it came to teenage music, as it was called, you had it all, and we were just copying you, and not very well either.
That's funny.
So these guys in this story, they didn't want to hear anything from England. They didn't want to hear what was going on in the English recording studios.
They hated the Shadows even.
They hated the Shadows for all sorts of reasons, but they actually, in the volume 2, they get to know them quite well and have good relationships with them.
Don't tease us. We have 7 more years. Come on.
Yeah. But they really hated what they stood for rather than actually the guys themselves. Yeah.
I wanted to talk about the attitude of the men in Liverpool at that time, because I think it's important with Paul. When Mary passes, Paul's reaction is not one that you would have expected. He's more concerned about the money.
Well, it's a comment that is made. I don't think you can take it too much out of context.
Well, no, but there was something else that I thought of after. If the case of men being the breadwinners instead of bread makers,
yes,
I think you say, how important for John Lennon in 1975 to become a bread maker.
Yes.
I mean, and he was such a teddy boy and a rough guy.
Yeah.
I mean, to do a 180.
Yeah, well, that was John. He did a lot of 180s. Yeah, I mean, women's lib and all that followed in the late 60s, or particularly through the 70s and 80s, was unknown in this period of time. The roles were much more clearly defined and accepted by both genders. And in the north of England, there's always been that more male-oriented the society than in the south of England, and that's quite strong there anyway. So they grew up, certain things are women's jobs and these are men's jobs, and there's no crossing over. So for John, 20 years later, to have made that switch, it's just a sign of his own personal development. Isn't it?
And if you'd wanted your girl to dress like Brigitte Bardot, she dressed like Brigitte Bardot.
Yeah, you kind of make her. And there are elements in this book where John was physically violent to women that don't make for very pleasant reading. But they're part of the story, because for a man for whom physical violence was kind of not exactly part of life, but not something he was known to do, it was amazing for him by the late 60s that he's preaching peace all the time.
Right.
That again is part of his life journey. If you like, I mean, I'm interested in the fact that when it comes to biography, on any subject, not just the Beatles, but you just need to pick two moments in time, and that is the beginning and the end of your story. And you could do a John Lennon biography that begins with him hitting someone and ends with him calling for peace. And the journey in between is the story of how he actually came to go from that point to that point.
And getting better somewhere in the middle in 1967 of I used to be cruel to my woman, I beat her.
Starting to admit what he was doing.
Psychological
I mean, the thing about John, why do we know this stuff about him hitting people? It's because he actually said it of himself to his own detriment.
Yeah. As far as that Paul McCartney attitude, he hated the words should and ought. He would run the other way.
To this day.
Yes, and
you're right.
I think
they're a key part of his personality.
Yeah, I think that's important.
So we should tell him that he shouldn't be on our show.
Right, yes, he'll come to us.
Yes, sorry.
No, but I think that's important because you see, again, even when he's a young boy, he goes the other way, and as you said, all the way to this day. In a lot of key aspects of his life, you can see that, but you really didn't know that about him prior to this.
And again, it's not me saying it. I know I'm repeating myself here,
I know, but it's your book, so.
But it's him saying it. If you look deep enough, you can find a number of instances where he said that of himself, and that's much better than me saying it.
Yes.
Because if he says it of himself, it's fine. It's
and he
right.
mentioned it about Linda too. Would say it to him, and he was very strongly mentions that in several interviews about.
And it ties in directly too with something that you were saying earlier about John, where too, if John had ever been the close friend to Paul who had said, Paul, you ought to do this because I'm doing it. You should do that. That chemistry never would have happened.
Yes.
It was a natural leader-follower, I won't say follower relationship,
well,
but
maybe
it seemed to be organic.
But again, a lovely phrase from Paul that I use in the book is that John was their fairground hero.
Yeah.
And I don't know that... Obviously, there's so much about them we don't know and we'll never know, just the truly one-on-one stuff where no one else was around. But
of course.
I don't know that John ever said the word should to Paul, but just John was a natural leader for Paul.
Right.
But at the same time, enable Paul to make a proper contribution.
We haven't talked about Pete Best yet.
I swear, I was just about to go there.
You said that the quote I'm going to take from the book is that John, Paul, and George had a disconnected existence from Pete.
Yes.
He was there for 2 years.
Yeah.
But he doesn't seem to be a friend, according to what I read in the book.
He and John had a friendship of a kind, but not enough for John to ever want to keep him in the group.
Right.
The only reason he was there 2 years, it's quite clear, is that they were too cowardly to do anything about it. Again, I think that's John's own words, until they eventually had someone to sack him for them, which was Brian, who they made Brian do the dirty work that they had been reluctant to do themselves.
Have there been any earlier moments where they could have gotten rid of him and they chose not to?
Not that I know of. They could have got rid of him at any time, and that's in a way a point in itself. The fact that they could get rid of him, it just shows that was his position in the group was expendable.
But he was booking though too.
They were the Bests became indispensable to the running of the group.
Right.
From the moment they get back from Hamburg the first time, it's Pete and his mother who are kind of organising the bookings, and it's their friends, including Neil, who are driving the Beatles around, and suddenly, if they get rid of Pete, they've got to do all this stuff themselves, and it's just kind of easier to just let things go. But he's never going to be there forever. He may or may not have known it, but he was always on borrowed time.
You have to wonder whether or not there was some kind of underlying psychology from Mona to the more they made themselves indispensable,
Yeah.
Maybe she was even aware that Pete had some limitations as a musician. But
I doubt it. I doubt it. I mean, she called the Beatles "my son's group," which I think probably didn't go down very well with the other three guys.
Particularly John.
Her devotion to her son was really quite extraordinary, and his to her similarly.
Well, she had a problem, or George had a problem, and Paul had a problem with Nora, didn't they?
Not that I mean, they all fell out with her when they stopped playing the Casbah the first time.
Right.
And they wouldn't have forgotten that any more than she would have forgotten it. I don't really know too much about what they thought of her or she thought of them. And we'll probably never know that stuff.
But also, their house was way on the other side of town.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful house. And I'm like, wow, this is a huge house. A piece of land is huge, too. But the other three Beatles didn't have that.
No,
that size of a house.
No, it was definitely an experience for them to go over there. But they all lived in the south end of Liverpool, and he lived in the north end. And these guys only ever really got around by bus,
right,
in those days, or a series of buses.
It's hard to believe. You know, they're carrying their guitars or their amps and they're going on buses.
Ringo running 400 feet at a time to go grab
one drum
with one drum
because
and moving
he couldn't carry the whole set.
Unbelievable.
Now the other thing with Pete is that I didn't realize that contractually, Brian was told you may have to actually break up the Beatles and reform them.
Well, there's another breakup story that happens in '62. Yeah. When it came to dismissing Pete, when John, Paul and George told Brian, you've got to do it. And by the way, Brian Epstein, I say this in the book, Brian Epstein's business cards, he described himself, he said the Beatles, Brian Epstein, soul direction, which was a phrase he'd picked up from somewhere. But he never had soul direction over the Beatles. No one could have soul direction over these guys. Anyone who thinks that Brian could have just dictated to the Beatles like that doesn't understand the mechanics of the way this band worked.
So the Decca audition, the Beatles picked those songs basically. It wasn't Brian Epstein.
It was interesting for me on this project to actually look at how some of these myths took place, because the myth about that one is that Brian made them do this repertoire, and it was probably that repertoire that failed them, the audition, and he had meddled in the music and he should have left alone, and it was their business, not his, and all that. And actually all that is completely untrue, and it comes from the Hunter Davis book, and he didn't really say it either.
Right.
But there's been it's been an interpretation of what he wrote in that book that's become popular myth. The only influence Brian had on their set list that day, so far as I can see, is to suggest that they did 3 of their own songs, because they were not doing their own songs on stage until they met Brian. They always avoided it. They were embarrassed by them. They didn't think their audience would want them. Mm-hmm. So they seem to have begun playing their own songs on stage the same week that he became their manager. I can't say that he made them or suggested it, but it's more than likely, because it's quite a strong coincidence.
And it ended up actually being very beneficial to them that they had done because of the publishing situation that comes up later.
It was through doing those 3 songs at Decca that they actually got the contract to EMI, through the publishing situation, as you say. So, if anything, Brian Epstein's meddling, so-called, in their Decca set list actually got them the Parlophone contract. And let's face it, they were much better off with George Martin than they would have been at Decca.
Definitely.
Oh yeah.
It was so. We should be really grateful they failed that test.
And
that really grateful.
Changed the course of history.
And incidentally, when I talked to the engineer on that session, a guy called Mike Savage, who again since has died. Mike told me.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Mike told me that had Decca signed the Beatles, they weren't going to use Pete Best.
Wow.
So, but Camphor had 2 sessions with the Beatles. He barely allowed Pete to drum on. He certainly didn't let him use his bass drum or his toms on the My Bonnie sessions. The Decca guy said we wouldn't have used Pete, and George Martin said we wouldn't have used Pete. So that's 4 sessions in a row where the drummer has not impressed the technical people.
They would have brought in Bernard Purdy, I think. That's what was.
He was waiting outside the door, just bursting to come in.
That's a myth also, because Pete always is puzzled at why he was fired. And I thought I missed something in the book, because you always said he knows exactly why. And you read, I'm thinking, wow.
Mitch called me and said, did I miss
something in the book?
Yeah.
I mean,
said that
what's going on? And no, he just wasn't good enough.
Right.
And it's there. And even the Beatles, when they knew they wanted him sacked, they stopped going to the Casbah.
Yeah.
a good, 2 or 3 months prior
a couple
to...
of months. The club closed anyway.
Right.
But,
well, did it close because they stopped, or...?
I think it closed because Mona was heavily pregnant at that point. Right. 8 months pregnant.
Yeah.
And that's also another myth of why Pete was sacked, maybe because of the situation with Neil and Mona, and it's just all... It's nonsense. It's just
there's a lot of myths. Good. It comes down to them feeling. Again, let's not say he wasn't good enough. Let's say they didn't find him good enough.
Right.
Because that is more to the point. It's not what we think. It's really what they thought. They knew he wasn't good enough for what they wanted, and they also knew that they didn't gel as a band. Now, if you've played in a band, you will know when the chemistry is right and when it isn't right. And with him, it was never quite right. And whenever they played with Ringo, it worked.
Yeah.
So
you even have a moment where Neil, who was his best mate, even
that
comments.
That was the thing. When Neil, I close one of the chapters with Neil saying, before Ringo, it was always John, Paul, George, and a drummer.
Right.
And that's Pete's best mate saying it.
Yeah.
So I think that's good enough.
Yeah, without a doubt.
And as you said, they were concerned that they might lose Neil.
Yeah, very.
As their, not only their roadie, but they're roadie, but they're friends as well.
Yeah.
I mean, he really was Pete's best friend, so that was a big
he was one of them.
Yeah.
But there's also a moment too where, and again, something that I had never seen before, taking away from the idea of Brian going in and blindsiding Pete. Which, again, was always sort of the impression that we got. It just dropped out of nowhere. But there's implication that Brian had gone in a few months earlier to address the scenario, the situation.
When he first became their manager and they said to him, get rid of Pete, he stalled it and said, not now, because, things are happening now and I'm trying to get you deals and contracts and not now. I don't know exactly what they said between them, but things carried on pretty much the same. But to come back to your question earlier, Rob, that Brian was contracted to the 4 guys to provide them with work. That was the contract that they had signed. Right. And when Brian took legal advice about how to dismiss Pete, the lawyer said, well, actually, you're obliged to provide him with paid work and he could sue you if you break the contract. Right. So Brian then had this tortuous process of trying to find a way in which he could still provide work to Pete whilst he wasn't in the Beatles. And the lawyer said about the best way of doing it would be to break up the group, void this contract, and then sign another contract without Pete. And later, in a letter, the lawyer actually did say that to Pete's lawyer, because it did go legal very quickly, which is also a new discovery for me on this book. So, technically the Beatles broke up in August 62 and then reformed like a minute later.
Beatles Mark II.
One of the things I like about the book is that
one of the things you like?
Well, there's many things. The players who come up in like 62, 63, George Martin, you actually talk about like 61.
Yeah.
And we know that when I Want to Hold Your Hand came out and Capitol didn't do anything because of Dave Dexter Jr., that George Martin was really angry. Now we know why.
Yes.
Because George Martin and Dave Dexter Jr. go back, and Dave Dexter Jr. keeps rejecting all of George Martin's songs.
Yes.
Because he's Dave Dexter Jr. and doesn't know anything.
Yeah.
Which I find very interesting.
That's a generalization.
Well, don't worry, we're saying the inflammatory stuff here. Send your legal notices to Fab for Free for All.
Dead.
Sorry.
It's more of a corporate thing. Dexter Jr. is just the embodiment of a corporate attitude at Capitol towards its owner in England. It hated, obviously, the people at Capitol must have hated being owned by guys in London.
Right.
Who didn't understand them, and they obviously felt that they were much more progressive than them and much more successful. They had Sinatra and Peggy Lee and all that stuff.
That's true.
Well, the Beach Boys
thought of that.
And they just obviously were sticking up a finger to their owner the entire time. And the Beatles' rejections are merely part of a pattern of constant rejection of pretty much everything that was coming over.
Makes total sense.
And actually, if Capitol put their stuff out in '63, it probably wouldn't have been a success anyway. The way time's out, the way this...
It all works out, but I mean, the fact that the Beatles ended up on Capitol is actually, to me, a bit of a disappointment. I think they would have preferred to stay on VJ if they had known what it was.
Yeah.
Well, as an R&B label,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What company?
Yeah.
Of course, the VJ might not have been around.
I mean, that's all just speculation, but I do like the fact that Dexter did release some things from England just to keep them satisfied to a tiny degree, and the people he chose to release, for example, Mrs. Mills, He turns down the Beatles and Cliff Richard and Helen Shapiro and all our big acts in England, Adam Faith, and he does release Mrs. Mills. Now, have you ever heard Mrs. Mills?
No. Do I want to? That's the question.
Go on YouTube and check out Mrs. Mills.
We have Mrs. Miller.
Yeah, Mrs. Miller sang in a kind of weird, out of tune way, right?
And she actually did Beatles stuff.
She did Beatles stuff.
Mrs. Mills didn't sing. She was just a middle-aged woman sitting at a piano playing kind of pub honky-tonk stuff.
Well, I could see that being better than the Beatles.
Yeah, there you go.
That's the next big Beatles.
Yeah.
You know, you had mentioned music and how the Beatles got their records, and I wanted to talk about the first record George Harrison never got. Rock Around the Clock.
Yeah.
How important was that as opposed to what was popular at the time, Skiffle with Lonnie Donegan? And I think you say very cleverly in the book that was popular because Skiffle practitioners were known to occasionally wash. I mean,
yes.
I love that line in the book. So they were accepted.
Yeah, that's the Daily Mirror writer.
Yeah,
because rock was reviled when it came up, right? Yeah. It's such a part of the fabric of our life these days. But if you look at this life in context, in the 1950s, it was the music of delinquency. Yeah. And the Daily Mirror said, as if it knew what it was talking about, that the skiffle guys wash, indicating therefore rock guys don't.
Well, they had a washboard.
Lord. On that note, no. Yeah. On that bad note.
Yeah. But skiffle and rock actually came up at the same time, and that was a surprise to me when I researched this book. Actually, they were in tandem. Mm-hmm. And when skiffle was at its absolute peak, which was kind of February, March 57, The Girl Can't Help It arrives in Liverpool. Yeah. The first colour Hollywood rock and roll movie, which ran for weeks and weeks and weeks and was a great influence on all the kids. So actually they've got this stuff in London that's coming up, which is American music through a London filter, being produced by George Martin, among others, with the Vipers. And they've got the stuff that is pure Americana, you know, the Carl and the Eddie Cochrans and Gene Vincents and all of that in colour in 1957. And the combination of the two is what takes it forward. Skiffle bursts quite quickly. It's only a bubble. But it does encourage young kids to pick up guitars.
Right.
And what's surprising, though, and you get to this in the book, which I found very unusual, they go to see Bill Haley.
Yeah, Paul does.
Paul goes to see Bill Haley.
Yeah.
But yet, and what was surprising about that was that it was disappointing. You mentioned that in the book. There was a disappointing experience.
Yeah, because
to see Bill Haley.
He thought the whole show would be Bill Haley. He believed he was going to see Bill Haley, and in fact, he only got Bill Haley in the second half of the show, which actually was more than the Beatles would do in their shows. But still, it wasn't much. It wasn't the whole evening. The first half was Vic Lewis Orchestra. Right. And Vic Lewis went on to work with the Beatles in the late 60s, and the drummer was Andy White.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. How funny. And yet they don't go see Buddy Holly when he comes around.
That is most peculiar.
Very strange.
I do not understand that at all. Buddy Holly was playing on the street where they went to school, and they were in school that day, and when they came out, Buddy was just along the street rehearsing, playing that night. Not only Buddy Holly, but the Crickets, and not only that, but the Fender Stratocaster and everything, and they didn't go. And I don't know why they didn't go, but they just didn't go.
Very odd.
Yeah.
There's so much we didn't cover.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask
just one more thing, Columbo.
One more thing. When you talk about, this goes back to the beginning of the interview, you said to write a biography was different than all the other writings you've done.
Yeah.
How is that with what you're writing? Because I found the books, when you wrote them, very entertaining. I found it very knowledgeable. There's great stories in there. So what's the difference writing, the complete Beatles Chronicle compared to this?
Well, the Chronicle is, I mean, as you know, it's essentially a reference book, but it does have those year-by-year introductions as well. They were, guess they were geared, I didn't really venture into their personal lives before. I always kept it strictly to what their professional endeavours were. And with this book, you obviously have to get right inside their families and their personal lives and look at them as people in a more rounded way. So, I mean, I didn't want this book to be a book about legends. I just wanted it to be about guys, 4 young kids who grow up with different personalities to those around them and find each other and do stuff. You obviously, it is a different discipline because you've got to make sure that each thing flows into the next. And you've got to have a strong beginning and a strong end for every chapter. So there's a lot of differences in terms of the approach to writing this, because I'm looking for good stories.
For a narrative.
Whereas in the past I was mostly looking for facts and the stories that came with them.
Right.
is there one thing in this, during your research for this particular volume, that you yourself were just blown away by? I mean, there's probably many, but is there one thing that you really would like to say to everybody now? This is
the one you did the happy dance for.
Yeah.
Oh God, there are so many of those. So many of those moments in the library where I punched the air. Yeah. So many of those.
Give us one when you really punched the air.
Well, it's just a trifling one, really. But when the Beatles went to Scotland in 1960, driving around the Highlands in a van, and it was involved in a crash, and when they crashed, it was at the top of the hill coming down into Banff. I know because I've been there and looked at exactly why they crashed, because it's a difficult junction. And after they crashed, someone came running out of the house, a kid came running out of the house, and having heard that there was an incident outside her front door, and saw that they were entertainers, and rushed back inside and got her autograph book, and came back out and got the very first ever set of Beatles autographs, which you can see on the internet, and they're going to be in the extended edition of this book. Well, that gave me the date and time of the crash and the place of the crash. So I then went to the little local newspaper in Scotland, which I'd looked at before, looking for advertisements as to whether they might have played there. But I hadn't looked for news of the crash.
Wow.
And this time I was in the library, and I'm going through every tiny paper. This is like, can't remember the name of the paper now, but anyway, it's right up there in the top of Scotland, a little local paper. And I found the report, and it's the very first time the Beatles were ever mentioned in print.
Wow.
So, millions of articles and books later,
and there it is.
There had to be
because
a first
crash.
Wow.
Yeah, and there it was, and it had B-double-E, not B-E-A,
right.
A common misspelling for years to come, but there it was. And it was like, yes! Just to find that in the library. And it's just a line in the book, but it's just typical of the good times I had researching this.
Very
There's
cool.
so much in this book.
There will hopefully be another, 14 years of fun researching ahead?
It's hard to say. It really is.
Okay, right?
I
don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a good way.
Although we may not be around based on what he just told us.
It is a concern. I genuinely, laughs aside, I do wish I'd started it a little bit younger.
Right.
But because I'm 55 now, and I have, personally speaking, I have more years of hard slog ahead of me than I would like to have done.
Right.
I mean, I love my work and everything, but it really is very hard work. And I try and do a double day every day. So if you like, this 10 years was really like 20.
Yeah.
And it remains to be seen how much I can sustain that kind of schedule as I get older. But so far I'm in good health.
That's good.
That's good.
But every time I try and guess on this project how long something will take or how big it might be, it always ends up being different.
Wow.
But the next volume, not that you're giving anything away, but the next volume is the most,
It's
the formidable years of the Beatles.
Yeah.
And you've given so much detail into this. I mean, I can't imagine how you're going to do it for 63 through wherever you're going to go, 67 or so. I mean, unbelievable. Because you're not only doing the UK piece, you're doing the world.
America and the world, yeah. I mean, America's in this book a lot, I'm really pleased to say. But from volume 2 onwards, America is in it totally.
So are you going to be in our library? Our libraries here, looking at all the microfiche.
Yes.
Oh, Lord.
Yes, I have been already, and I will do much more of that.
Because they're in the papers and magazines daily.
Yeah.
I mean, there's pretty much from 64 on, the papers were the Beatles.
And it isn't just the things about the Beatles being recorded, because actually what the American papers reported on the Beatles' daily activities was not as good as what we were doing in England, because it was happening there. So I need to look at their impact on American life and life around the world as well, because this book is definitely Beatles outside in and inside out. So it's their stories of everything that they experienced and went through, and the impact they had on other people around them, but also on the wider world, how people saw them, how people's lives were changed by them. Because I really, since they had such a phenomenal impact, I really do need to show it.
Sure.
And I need to tell the story of all the music in the 60s.
So are you going to go to Manila and get kicked and punched by the same people?
I would like to go to Manila. I'd like to go to Manila. I'd like to really research that. I'd like to see if there are government papers there, if the Marcos had papers. I'd like to see anything I can find in any archive.
That'll be interesting.
Yeah, a lot of there must be something. I mean, I've already gone through the Manila newspapers for '66, and actually there was a lot of TV coverage of their visit to Manila, none of which exists as far as I know. It's not circulating among collectors. Not really.
We'll try to help.
Can I make a bad joke and say it's probably hiding in a manila envelope somewhere?
Oh my God.
Good.
Wow. On that note, wrap it up.
Thank you very much.
You know, we're having a nice conversation here, and we get a really bad joke.
But I didn't do it in a British accent.
Thank God.
There we go.
Well, that's a really...
He can do a real British accent.
Although I got to tell you, when Clive does the ladies, he sort of sounds like, a bad Monty Python. It's actually very funny.
The pepper pots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Those pepper pot women existed in England, by the way. They really... I knew a few pepper pots in my team.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap it up. There is so much more we could talk about, and hopefully we will see you again before the next book comes out.
Yeah, you will.
And for Fab 4 Free for All, go out there, grab the Beatles Tune In by Mark Lewis, and you will...
What's the official
title?
Well, the Beatles All These Years is the series.
Right.
And then Volume 1, Tune In.
Why all these years, by the way?
It just seemed appropriate because it's all these years in their lives, it's all these years in our lives. And when you're writing a history, to actually be able to say it's all these years is actually quite nice. And of course, it is a song lyric.
Yes.
I didn't really want to get into the song lyrics. I wanted to avoid it. It's been done to death, cliched. But I just felt that all these years, just plucked out of the Sgt. Pepper album, was quite nice. And in fact, Tune In is also... But this was purely unintentional.
Oh, Ringo said after all these years?
But Tune In is in Strawberry Fields Forever.
Yeah, wow. But a lot of people are going to ask, though, and I asked you in a social situation, is it going to be tune in, turn on, drop out? And you said no.
And I said it won't be.
Okay. So there you go.
I said, would it be tune in, stay tuned, signing off? And you said no to that one too.
Definitely
so
not to that.
Let's have a 7-year contest.
A 7-year contest.
We're going to have a 7-year contest for our fans. You'll have to keep listening for the next 7 years. Send in your thought of what you think Mark's going to actually title the next book. It will have no influence on him whatsoever.
No, not at all.
But still, anyway. So for Fab 4 Free for All, thank you again, Mark, for joining us. And as always, signing off with Mr. Rob Leonard.
Thank you for showing up.